Okay. Hi, my name is Marina. I'll be having a lecture on an introduction to judging. So, first, we'll go into the basic rules. So, do note that this will be brief. Like, I won't be discussing all rules very comprehensively. And if you do plan to judge a tournament, I highly suggest that you do get adequate training and briefing beforehand. So before you judge the tournament, make sure that you understand all the rules of whatever format it is you're judging and that you do get to train and practice delivering your oral adjudication or managing a panel. So as a chair, your main duty is to maintain and ensure decorum in the round. So especially now that it's online, it gets a little bit more tricky, but generally you have to make sure that all judges and all teams are present. So this includes as well the rules of equity, and we'll discuss later how those types of violations play out onto the round. But generally, this includes things like asking debaters to introduce themselves or even the panel to introduce themselves and to give their preferred pronouns. And when you see that equity violations occur, like even if it's an accident, you just give a reminder, for example, to the people in the round to follow the rules of equity. You also facilitate the panel discussion. So this is ideally done within 15 minutes, although admittedly, especially for higher rounds, it will take a lot more. So you ensure that a fair discussion occurs. So pretty much make sure that all people, especially if they have different decisions on a round and different opinions on that, get to voice out why they thought so and that no one is left out of the discussion. So you facilitate that and then you arrive at a consensus on who you think got first, second, third, and fourth. And if it's impossible, like you're nearing the 15-minute mark, or the discussion has been going on for a really long time, facilitate a vote so that majority will just take that win for that. So you decide speaker scores as well as a panel after the final decision. So if your final decision is different from your initial call, that's why you decide the speaker scores of each individual speaker after that final decision on that consensus that you made as a panel. So for the oral adjudication, if you are the chair and you were not ruled by panelists, you're the one who's giving the OA. If it's Asian parliamentary format, and you're three, for example, in the panel, one chair, two panelists, all of you give an OA. This is a maximum of 10 minutes, although it's very rare that it would need to take up all the whole 10 minutes. It would be the case for a very close round, but usually you can do it in 5 to 7 minutes. So you also give general comments if only there were consistent problems in the round. Like for example, it was very consistent that teams were not responding to each other and they were just giving arguments and substantives for their side and seemingly not listening to what the other team said. You can say that as a general comment that teams are very unengaging. You give the decisions and the rankings. So ideally give this at the start of your oral adjudication. Like it's also a lot, like aside from the fact that debaters don't want to wait until the end of your OA or wait progressively for your decision to be given, it just makes it a lot clearer because it sets the direction of your OA. Like obviously if a team went first or last, you'd probably discuss them in that order, either ascending or descending. So you also deliver the justification then for each team. We'll discuss how to do that better later on. So again, you have to be nuanced and specific in how you justify. So think to yourself always, how would you want your judge to be justifying it to you? So obviously you don't want very generic statements. You don't want very generalized statements. You'd want them to be specific and you'd want to know that they actually listen to you. So ask yourself things like, what did the team say? Why was that uncompelling in comparison to what the other team said? So yeah, as much as possible, try to cite as well what the debaters in the round said and take it off from there. So explain why it was insufficient, explain why one was more compelling than the other. So the structure or the organization varies. There's really no strict way to do it, especially in BP. If it is a bench window, it would be fine to discuss why one bench won over the other. So it is fine in some instances to clump them together, like as a bench, if they won as a bench anyway. Like for example, it was an op bench win, you can discuss that first. Then you can discuss why it was 1/2. Then you can discuss why it was 3/4. So your role and what you can and should be doing. So the general standard we have is you're an average intelligent voter. So what does that person look like? So first is you have no specialized knowledge. So whether you're in high school or in college, if you have specialized knowledge about something, like for example, medicine or economics, but no one in the round, and this is the important thing to know, no one in the round was able to call out a flaw or a mistake, then you should not be stepping in, and the speaker who said that faulty fact, for example, shouldn't be penalized. You can, however, in your personal comments, tell them, oh, this is wrong, like I know this to be untrue, but obviously it cannot play out into the ranking in the round or to their speaker points. Second is you're also willing to be persuaded. So that means that you don't have a significant bias. So you're not leaning towards more liberal ideas or more conservative ideas, but you're willing to be persuaded by those certain ideas. So you're open that way. You fully understand the rules of debate. So we'll discuss other relevant ones later on. We discussed the basic ones earlier. You're non-interventionist, so you don't step into the debate, especially when it's not needed. You just take it as it is. But there are times where you will need to resolve things, so that's not intervening. If there's, for example, a clash that was left as a deadlock, for instance, how then do you weigh that? But you don't intervene and say for yourself which one is more important. You still use what went on in the debate as a standard for why one was more important than the other. You also can understand complex concepts and follow the logical flow of the round. So that means that even if an idea is very complex or the speaker was very highfalutin when he discussed it, it means that you will still put an effort to try to understand that. You're also an active and critical thinker. So you know if something is persuasive, you know if something is compelling, you know if something is not compelling, and you can pinpoint why it was not compelling. So things that you shouldn't do. So you cannot give an automatic fourth or losses to teams. So even if the team misunderstood the motion, for example, they set the flawed setup, but no one in the round noticed it or no one in the round contested it, they shouldn't be given an automatic fourth just because of that. Or even in terms of an equity violation, especially if it was an accident or whether it was deliberate, you have to judge the round still fairly and in order to maintain the integrity of the round. So there's no such thing as that's what we mean when we say there's no such thing as an automatic fourth. You also cannot allow your personal biases to affect your decision. So just because you believe, for example, that a certain policy should pass or should not pass does not mean that you will give the team that defends the side that you agree with an advantage that way. You also cannot be a sitting duck, merely absorbing and believing everything a speaker says. Like, for example, the contention is a speaker's just saying that's untrue. You cannot simply like absorb it and say, oh, the speaker said that is not true, therefore it is not true. Like, you have to assess if the way that speaker responded was in a substantive way. Did they really refute what was being said by the previous speaker? Is it compelling enough? Was it holistic enough? And also try not to be generic in your oral adjudication. So as mentioned earlier, try to be very nuanced and specific in how you discuss. Okay, so for managing panels, especially if you're the chair, again, make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak after some time after the round. So if they don't have an initial call, ask them like, would you need like 2 minutes or 3 minutes to get that? Then you gather it. Usually in cleaner, more obvious rounds, there's going to be like the obvious rankings. The contentions would be like the first, second, the third, and the third, the fourth, possibly. So you do lead the discussion for that also if that happens. So what has to be resolved? What does the panel agree and disagree on? So for example, you're all sure on who is the fourth and who is the first, but people are divided on who should get the 2 and the 3. So in those cases, it's very obvious that the panel has to discuss why a certain team deserves a 2 and why a certain team deserves a 3. So you then allow your panelists to discuss why that was their call and the other relevant points. So you discuss the clashes between the 2 and the 3, or the 2 teams who are vying for those positions. So in messier rounds, however, it's going to be that it's not as intuitive as that. So you have to learn how to manage it as well. So generally, if there is a majority as well, giving the one team, for example, a win, you allow those panelists to explain why, then you allow the dissenting panelists to explain why they think otherwise. And eventually they can or panelists will say whether they're willing to concede to a particular type of allocation for the wins and the losses in the team. So generally, just make sure that all your panelists with the differing opinions especially are able to voice out why they thought so. So this is where we discuss then the rule violations and what to do when it happens. So the simplest thing to do is to just not credit the advantage to the team. So for example, a new argument was at whip, and it was clearly a very new argument that would benefit that team, so closing government or closing opposition. But obviously, we all know that you cannot build at whip. You cannot give new material at whip because no one will be able to respond to you. So you can just remove that credit to them. So as a result, that means that the team was less convincing or less persuasive. You also should not overly penalize though for actively harming the debate. So for example, a squirrel, they misunderstood the motion, for example. Um, so just penalize them for the lack of their persuasiveness, but do not overly penalize for the rule violation in and of itself. So for contradictions, though, credit only what the first speaker mentioned and not what the latter speaker mentioned, the latter contradictory argument. So this is just a general rule internationally for contradictions. Just credit what the first speaker said and just do not credit what the latter contradiction was said. It's just easier and cleaner that way. And it would be unfair to credit both because, obviously they are contradictory. So if you're aware a setup is wrong, but no one in the round points it out, assume the setup to be true for the purposes of the debate and do not penalize anyone. But you can mention it in your OA. You can say this didn't play out in the decision. You can mention it in personal comments, things like that. So again, this is where you cannot be interventionist and where your specialized knowledge cannot play in, especially if no one called it out in the round. So how to resolve rounds? So generally, try to be comparative and apply your standards fairly. So you have to be holistic. So if you're going to claim that you're penalizing a particular team because they were unresponsive, apply the same standard in assessing the whole round. So obviously, it's very difficult in BP because there's the opening and then there's the closing. But there are different ways or metrics to assess how impactful each team was. So for example, for opening, some of their material can implicitly respond to or already deal with closing material, or they could be raising POIs. So you should be listening to those POIs when they're trying to engage. So be very holistic and not just very myopic in how you apply those standards to the teams. So assess also the logical flow of the debate and what the fair expectations are from each team. One of the easiest ways to decide what is relevant in the round was to check what do the teams agree on, whether explicitly or implicitly. So it can be implicit, like for example, if their arguments are revolving around a particular theme, or if they're conceding to a particular goal, that means they're implicitly saying that that is something they agree with. That shows what was relevant in the round and what should be deemed important by the judge. So in your panel discussion, those are things that you can take into account. So if the various things were defended as relevant, so in the instance that the round was very messy and a lot of teams were arguing for different things, different goals, claiming that different things were important, we first have to assess how well argued its relevance was, because those do count as argumentations. But secondly, it's also good to check how holistic the team's case was. So did they engage with the other side's best case? Were they able to discuss things that were not their own best case? So that's one thing to note. But however, if teams were unengaging and really did not weigh all throughout and were just like blurting out their arguments, what would the average intelligent voter find more important? Although it's very rare that teams will not argue why their case is important, it may come to a point where you as the average intelligent voter would have to decide for yourself or decide as the panel on what then is more important. So the not so basic rules are things that people usually don't remember but should definitely keep in mind. So one is that rebuttals and other materials that are not arguments and are not explicitly stated as unique should count as extensions for closing themes. So closing themes do not have to say that this is the extension, this is new. Although it's good if they do, and it's highly encouraged that they do, we expect judges to be able to tell if something is new material or not. And we expect judges to be able to tell what is derivative material and what is unique material. So for example, if closing government argues why OG's material is more impactful and important than OO's, and OO and OG rather was unable to argue that and to argue the relevance of their own arguments, that counts as an extension for CG. So credit that to closing government and not opening government. So yeah, just make sure that even if things are not explicitly flagged as extensions, they do count as extensions. And I think a lot of judges often forget that. Next, if OO setup is reasonable, or if their alternative or counterprop is a reasonable one, teams, especially in closing, must weigh their policy or their proposal against the alternative and not against status quo. So pretty much make sure that it's fair. If it was an unfair counterprop, explain why and defend against status quo. But otherwise, if it was fair, they should be able to rebut, or closing teams or even DPM should be able to rebut and adjust to that. And as a judge, you have to be sure that you know as well what is reasonable and you're wary on how they defended its reasonability and its fairness. And if a closing team, for example, closing government, refuses that and they keep weighing it against status quo instead of OO's fair alternative, you can discredit CG for that. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, equity violations do not affect your speaks or your team's standing. Um, if it's very blatant discrimination and someone's just really being like a mean person in that way and just using derogatory terms, for instance, and they're not very compelling, that would naturally and consequently affect their persuasiveness. So a lot of rule violations actually already diminish your persuasiveness. Obviously, if you give a contradiction, that reduces your team's persuasiveness. If you're being mean and just blurting out equity violations, that also reduces your persuasiveness. So there is no need to over penalize, but as a natural consequence of the violation, they will not be as compelling anyway. So in assessing diagonals, and this is where it may get quite confusing. So you may credit openings arguments that implicitly deal with closing material. So again, even if it's not explicit, because obviously they have not heard closing argue, you have to assess the reasonable extent of openings arguments, and it also assesses the robustness of openings case. So that pretty much means that even if they're not explicit in saying that, oh, even if opposition says this, we say this, like if it's positive substantive, but it is material that can deal with what closing opposition, for example, was saying, then credit should go to opening government for being able to launch a very robust case. So listen as well to POIs being raised and credit accordingly, especially if it's opening trying to raise POIs to closing, or generally listen to all of the POIs, because those are ways that teams are able to engage with each other, and you have to credit that accordingly as well. So thanks and good luck in judging. If you have questions, you can reach out to me or you can reach out to IDEA and they'll forward it to me. Thank you. Bye.